Do you want to save money at the grocery store, eat more organic, whole foods, cultivate food security, and feel more connected to the earth? If so, then growing your own food is a no-brainer. You wouldn't believe how many people come to me claiming that they can't grow their own food. They think they don't have enough space, that they're too busy, or that they simply don't have what it takes. Perhaps you've fallen for one of these gardening myths. If you think you can't grow food, or if you think the only food that you have access to is what you buy in the grocery store, I have a life-changing webinar that you need to see. It's free and will help you unearth your inner gardener. I've helped thousands of people just like you learn to grow their own food, and I'm speaking from my own experience when I say that with the right knowledge in place, there is no such thing as a black thumb. With this webinar, you can begin making your garden dreams come true and start growing delicious, nutritious food for your family. Just text GARDEN to 44222 or go to iwanttogarden.com and you will receive our free webinar about the 7 key factors you need to know to grow your own food. Remember, that's GARDEN to 44222 or iwanttogarden.com.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the Grow Your Own Food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have John Rowden to talk about planting for birds. John joined the Audubon in 2009 when he was hired by the New York City chapter to direct citizen science and outreach throughout the city. In 2013, he transitioned to the National Audubon Society, first working on Toyota TogetherGreen program before becoming Audubon's Director of Community Conservation in 2016. John's work at Audubon has focused on engaging new audiences in the organization's conservation efforts, personally and through Audubon's extensive national network. He holds a PhD in zoology from Duke University. Welcome to the show today, John.
Thanks, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I always love talking about getting wildlife in our gardens. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
Well, you mentioned that I have a PhD in zoology, and I actually, for my PhD, I studied parrots in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I got to spend, and in fact, I was much more of a question-driven scientist rather than a taxonomically-driven scientist, meaning that birds weren't necessarily I wasn't bird crazy from an early age, like some of my colleagues at Audubon. I actually was much more approached to, I was very interested in studying behavior and how the current behavior that we see in organisms can relate to their evolutionary history. And it just so happened that birds and this particular group of parrots that I studied in Australia lent themselves to that work. So, and as I was doing that, spending a lot of time in Australia sitting out there in the bush watching birds, it just totally transported me. I really got sucked in by their beauty and their behavior. Birds are probably the wildlife that we humans have the most contact with, right? You see them in your garden, you see them in cities, you see them all over the place, and it's just, as somebody that's interested in behavior, I really love being exposed to and being around them. I've had the opportunity to teach in a variety of institutions, mostly as an adjunct faculty member, and I've taught animal behavior. And one of the things that I always tell my students as they're sort of trying to wrap their mind around how to study animal behavior is just go out and watch pigeons. City pigeons are living their lives right in our face.
They are, yes.
They're finding food, they're finding mates, they're raising their young, they're doing all of that, and it's a really great opportunity to get exposure to animals and their behavior and everything. So I spent some time in Australia. I also lived in New Zealand for a while, and there I was working. I directed the native conservation programs for the Auckland Zoo, and through that work, I got to work with a lot of the landowners in New Zealand that we were working on kiwi conservation. And, you know, as an American with this accent, I had to do a lot of relationship building and credibility building.
Right.
And it was really a fascinating thing to think about how do we actually link up bird conservation with how we relate to people. And that really, when I moved back to the U.S. and started working with Audubon, was what really drove me to, as you were describing it, right, that I work to really engage people in conservation work. And it's a lot of it is about building relationships, and it's about finding common ground with folks on how we all want to advance our own interests, and which are often really, really tied up in the natural world and can both benefit us and benefit birds. And so that's, I think, over time that's evolved from the time I got my PhD to now is how do we do that more effectively? And I think Audubon is a great platform for that.
Perfect. So you mentioned conservation work. Let's kind of define that for our listeners that don't know what that is.
Sure. Well, and Audubon's mission is really to work toward a world where birds and humans can thrive together. And I believe that we can get there, right? So conservation is really about how do we take this, this biosphere, this world that we've inherited from our ancestors, and how do we do a good job at actually protecting it and making it better so that when we hand it on to our descendants, that it's in good shape, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's both, again, from the human perspective, but also from the rest of the wildlife that we share this planet with, right? How do we actually take the space, all of the interactions that we have, all of that, and how do we actually think about how we steward that effectively so that we can hand that off?
So maybe how we can work best with nature?
Yes, absolutely. How we can work best with nature, and how we can actually, so much of conservation today, I think, is not about separating the natural world from the more developed world, right? There's just not that real, there's very few places around the world that are untouched by human activities.
Exactly.
And I think that we just have to think about how we integrate ourselves into the natural world, how we make sure that in that process that we're not harming it, but we're actually working to improve it. We're working to make sure that the ecosystem and the services that are necessary for ecosystem function are working properly, all of that. So we have to just think very carefully about how we're integrated, how we actually work with the natural processes and the wildlife and everything that exists with us.
Yeah. Perfect. So, and also for our listeners that don't know what the Audubon is, and I have to admit I don't know a lot about it. So tell us what the Audubon Society is and how it works.
Sure. Well, so the Audubon Society is actually it's over 110 years old at this point. It was founded in the early part of the 20th century.
Wow.
And we have it's a really extensive network of very community-based conservation chapters around the country. So we have over 460 chapters that are spread across the country.
Wow. I just got chills on that one. That's cool.
Right. So they're in communities large and small, everywhere from, there's a chapter in New York City to very small chapters that are operating in the rural environment around the country. We have 43 nature centers that exist around, as well as a number of sanctuaries. And so a lot of our work is embedded in communities, and I, of course, have the benefit of working with a lot of those chapters and helping them to extend their work and improve it in communities. We have a national organization as well, which is headquartered in New York City, which sort of sets the strategic direction for the organization and helps create tools and resources that can benefit those local chapters for the work that they're doing, and all in the service of actually helping birds and helping the people that they share their communities with.
Wow. Cool. Well, so I'm sitting here and I Googled Audubon. So I landed on Audubon, Arizona, given that we're in Arizona. And one of the things that I notice on the page is it says Audubon and then Central Flyway and then Arizona. And Can you speak to that? Because I have a sense I know what that is, but I want you to tell us.
Sure. So one of the things that we've done, relatively recently in the last 10 years is to try and sort of let the birds guide us more in how we do our conservation work. And so you're probably familiar that a number of bird species are migratory, and they follow migratory pathways between their breeding grounds, which are generally in the northern hemisphere or in the north, and their wintering grounds, which are further south. And there's generally, although there's not, strict, highways or anything like that, there's 4 general flyways that the birds follow on migration. So there's one along the Atlantic coast. There's one which follows the contours of that. There's one that generally sort of follows the Mississippi River and its tributaries. There's one that follows the backbone of the Rockies, and there's one that follows the Pacific coast. And so there's the Pacific Flyway, the Central Flyway, which Arizona sits in, the Mississippi Flyway, and the Atlantic Flyway. So those, we let the birds tell us. That's the journey that they take along those flyways. We work to organize ourselves along those flyways, and so we can actually work toward more full life cycle conservation for the birds. So birds that travel up and down the Central Flyway, we work to connect the work that's going on at Audubon Arizona with Audubon Rockies, with other Audubon groups within that flyway, so that we can work more, hand in glove. So we can work together with each other across that network to sort of help, as birds are either transiting through Arizona, that we can hand them off metaphorically to the folks up north of them to help with that full life cycle conservation.
Wow, how cool is that? I had a sense that's what it was, but I just needed some clarity on that. Cool. So we're here today to talk about the planting for birds, and my first question is kind of it's one of those questions like, well, it's obvious maybe, and that's, what's the connection between plants and birds?
Sure. Well, and it's a great question, and I think that plants, obviously, as they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, and they provide a lot of sources of, or important resources for a lot of wildlife and humans. But there's some really interesting connections and useful connections between plants and birds. So they do provide a lot of resources directly for birds, so meaning that there's, nectar that flowers provide for hummingbirds. There's berries and nuts and seeds that are actually food that are really important to birds. And also the physical structure of plants can be really important. So there's a lot of birds, woodpeckers, bluebirds, that actually nest in cavities inside trees. They also, of course, there's a lot of the branches provide substrate where other species build their nests on top of, so the structure of plants is really important.
Oh, yes.
But one of the other things is sort of a more indirect resource, and that's insects. And plants provide our hosts for a number of insect species, and those are really important to birds, particularly during breeding. So there's an entomologist that works out of the University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy, who's done a lot of really groundbreaking work on the connection between birds and plants and insects. And one interesting statistic that comes out of his work is that 96% of terrestrial bird species, land species, feed their babies on insects, and particularly caterpillars.
Wow.
And that's independent of what those birds eat as adults. So they may be seed eaters as adults, but they feed their chicks caterpillars. And
the
reason for that is, if you drill down into it, is that caterpillars are sort of these fantastic little packages of fat and protein that are really great. You shove those down those chicks' gullets, and it really helps them grow and reach the, be able to leave the nest. And so that's really, there's a big connection there. An important source of that protein and fat are these caterpillars. And plants, because insects lay their eggs on plants, and that provides, those plants provide a lot of the growth for those caterpillars. And so that's a really important connection between the birds and the plants as well.
Well, and that's a huge one for gardeners, because caterpillars are one of our big nemesis in the garden, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, in fact, having a lot of birds around can actually be a benefit, right? Because those birds will definitely be going after those insects.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
So how does one start wrapping their head around planting for birds?
All right. Well, so there's one other sort of important piece to the equation, and that is the origin of the plants. And so,
Right.
interestingly enough, there's been a long evolutionary history between the plants and the insects and the birds that live in the U.S. where we're operating, and because of that coevolutionary history, the insects that are here in those caterpillars, et cetera, are evolved to exist on native plants, actually plants that they've evolved with. And in fact, 90% of native insects really can only feed on native plants with which they've evolved. And so, it might be that that there's specific phytochemicals or something like that they
Right.
rely on, and so plants that aren't native to the U.S. don't provide as good of a host source for insects, right? So they may be unpalatable. They just have different phytochemicals that don't taste good or toxic or whatever. And so, and again, Doug Tallamy's research has really illustrated this, that if you look at native oak species, there's a number of oaks that are native to this country. Over 550 species of caterpillars can be found on those oaks. And so those butterflies and moths are selecting those oaks, laying their eggs, and provides that sort of, the food for them, and then that food, those caterpillars then provide food for birds.
Right.
And then if you think of a non-native species, and one of the most dramatic examples is the Gingko, which is a tree that's native to Eastern Asia. And it's a very commonly used street tree. It does well in poor soils and sort of city environments with less good air quality. There's only 5 species of caterpillars that have been documented on ginkgos. And so you can see that if you replace native species, and that's just these are proxies for the sort of broader non-native and native dichotomy. But you can see that if you do replace native species wholesale with non-native species, then you're actually just reducing the amount of food that's available to birds. And so that's sort of the background for what Audubon is trying to do, which is encouraging people to actually, in whatever sort of space they have, is to use more native plants. And one thing I want to be clear about is that, and we're talking about urban farming and everything, and so there's plots of land that are going to be used for farming, and that's great. And obviously that's an important aspect of all of our lives.
Right.
But I think there's opportunities wherever people are to include some native plants in their plot, whether they're doing urban farming, whether they have a yard, whether they have a patio, whatever. And actually having more native plants will actually benefit the birds, because those are just going to be those better hosts for insects.
Yeah. Wow.
And beneficial insects.
Exactly. So it sounds like step number one, and the biggest step, is to figure out what natives plants that you have in the area and nurture those, plant those out more.
Exactly. And we wanted to help people in that as much as we can. So we've launched our Plants for Birds program, which one of the centerpieces of that is a searchable database where people can input their zip code, and that will bring them a list of plants that are beneficial for birds in particular. So provide either those direct resources like seeds or nectar, or also are really good host plants for insects. So it provides the list of plants that are local to the person's area based on that zip code, what birds that will be attracted or will provide resources, those plants will provide resources for, what their local Audubon is, because we We know that planting and sort of all the complexities of site design and where, moisture requirements, light, all of those sorts of things. And their local Audubon can be a great source of support for that. So it connects them to their local Audubon, as well as a list of nurseries that are local to them that carry native plants. Because, we wanted to be as sort of give people as much information as we could that was locally relevant to them,
right?
And can sort of help set them up for success. And so that's something we've launched recently, and I encourage people to, if they're interested in thinking about how they might include more native plants in their little patch, to have a look at it.
Wow, that when you were sharing about that, it was like I was getting goosebumps thinking, my gosh, that is an amazing piece of work that you put together.
Yes, it's been an interesting and big challenge. As an ornithologist, I sometimes tell this to people. I've spent many years cramming a lot of bird information into my head, and I feel like in some ways I've sort of had to actively, I haven't assimilated plant information, and I'm kind of kicking myself now because there's so much to learn about plants. And there's a lot of, there's so many data layers to the database. We've worked really hard to include obviously the plant information, the bird information, the nursery information, and it's the first there are native plant databases around the country where folks can search for, information about native plants, but this is the first of its kind that's actually integrating all of that, particularly the bird aspect. How is this going to help birds, which is obviously Audubon's lens that we use.
Right, exactly. Wow. So where do people find out about the Plants for Birds database?
So you can go to audubon.org, our website. We have a landing page, which is audubon.org /plants for birds. And then as well, and there's all sorts of information. There's a really great brief video which just explains a lot of the information that I've just gone through with you about why native plants are better for birds. All sorts of information, about how to use plants to beautify your yard, some DIYs on how you can actually do different things like create seed bombs or nectar for hummingbirds. And then there's a link as well to the database, which is audubon.org /native plants, and that's where you can input your zip code. And it will take you. That's the search criteria. So if you know your zip code, you can step right into our space.
Makes it simple. Oh my gosh, you said something that I have to call you on. You said seed bombs. What's that?
Okay. So seed bombs is something that you can make. And there is a DIY video on our website where you just take seeds of native wildflowers native to your particular area, and you make up a little clay and dirt paste. You make a ball out of it. You put the seeds in it. When it dries, you can just put it in. You can toss it into a vacant lot. You can put it somewhere, and when it rains, it actually will disintegrate the ball. The seeds will germinate, and you'll have a native wildflower sort of bonus there.
There you go. Nice. So you mentioned pigeons a little earlier, and you kind of alluded toward putting a positive spin on pigeons. Now, we have pigeons here in Phoenix, and we have a lot of pigeons here in Phoenix, and we also have chickens in our backyard. So one of the things that I had to do was I had to completely enclose the chicken coop because I was feeding so much feed to the pigeons. So what I'd like you to do, and you started doing it a little bit, is kind of give us a positive spin on pigeons and maybe some other invasive species that we might have in our space.
Oh, goodness. It's hard to put a positive spin on invasive species, but I get this a lot, as you can imagine, right, as someone, that loves and talks about birds a lot. And my family and friends, sometimes ask me to defend birds that they don't find particularly beneficial or positive in their lives. And, so we're all familiar with pigeons and European starlings and house sparrows, none of which are native to North America, but are very common in our environment. And I can defend them only from really the standpoint of that I do find them, I just find them fascinating to watch. All of them are, again, sort of living their lives, cheek by jowl with us, right? They're right with us all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that I've speculated that one of the things that we find so sort of unnerving about pigeons or starlings is that I think that they sort of remind us of ourselves, right? They're just kind of scrabblers. They exist in this, these less than optimal environments. We've all seen the, like the one-legged or the one-eyed pigeon that somehow is still making it.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of, that hardiness and that sort of, you can't, these guys are really hard to get rid of and hard to kill, hard to, they're just going to continue to live right by us. I think that's kind of unnerving, but I think that it's a testament to their resilience, their adaptability, their ability to thrive in less than optimal environments. Again, it's hard for me to quote unquote defend them because I of course would love to see more native bird species, our fantastic avifauna that we have here, but I think that, a European starling in full breeding plumage, that's a really beautiful bird. It really does. Yeah. It's something to look at. And I do actually often, when I see them displaying and behaving, I actually do, sort of sit there and watch them because they really are kind of spectacular. It doesn't mean I wouldn't rather see perhaps, a Bullock's Oriole or something like that doing that same thing. But they're pretty, but birds, I'm not objective. Birds are just really fascinating creatures to watch.
So. Yeah, exactly. Well, you did a great job. And if nothing else, they bring in lots of manure for us for our gardens.
Good.
Yeah. So let's talk about planting for birds. And will that also attract and support insects as pollinators as well?
Sure. And that's, one of the interesting things, I think that we're probably all aware that pollinators are struggling as well as are, a variety of other native species. So bees and butterflies are having a tough go of it. And if we plant native plants, that particularly if we're thinking about the sort of structure and the diversity of plants that we're including, so we're including plants that provide nectar as well as other resources, they definitely can help our native pollinators, our native bees and butterflies as well. And again, because insects have co-evolved with the plants that are native to the U.S., that if we're planting more of those insects are really good at finding resources. They're moving around a lot, and so if we actually use or plant plants that are native, we can help support those pollinators as well. Some of which then will lay their eggs on those plants, and those will provide food for birds. And so it's, but some of those will still get through, and they'll still provide, they'll still increase the population of those pollinators.
Yay. And so does somebody need a big yard to plant for birds? No,
interesting. We want to encourage people anywhere and everywhere to be able to dig in. So if you have a yard, great. That's an opportunity. But if you only have a patio, or if you're more of an urban dweller and you have a fire escape, you can still put a little container with a nectar providing plant on it.
Right.
That's totally fine. And there's actually increasing, or there's data, people are starting to look at this more, where even small groups of plants can actually provide resources that you can have a measurable impact on insects and then by consequence birds, And of course it's better if there's connectivity and we have broader patches of it, but even small patches can be beneficial.
Yeah. Beautiful. Wow, that's a lot of great information. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Okay. Well, I will. I'm going to sort of stick on the Plants for Birds program, and one of the challenges that we have had with the program is that we received the plant range data from a partner called the Biota of North America program, which has a really extensive and fantastic database of plant ranges down to the county level.
Oh, wow.
And as I described to you, our search criterion is the zip code.
Yeah.
Right. And that is not obviously a one-to-one relationship. And there's a lot of the country where counties are small and relatively homogeneous, and so a zip code from one part of it has exactly the same plant diversity that another part of the county does. That's not the case out west. And I live in Los Angeles, you're in Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
So out west we have these large counties. We have very biodiverse counties. In Arizona, there's a lot of altitudinal variation. In Maricopa County, where you are, right, there's a lot of variation. Here in LA, we go from the coast to the mountains to the desert. And so we had some real challenges when we started. You know, if you put a zip code in LA County and you were getting plants that returned for the desert that were coming out on the coast or up in the mountains, whatever. And so that was a real problem. And so as we sat back and we said, okay, well, this is not a successful program if we're not going to be able to give that sort of detailed information, hyperlocal information that we need. And so we discussed it. We came up with a couple different solutions. So the first was that we included USDA hardiness zone info in, which you guys will be very familiar with. So we had to get an additional data layer to incorporate into our search results, and that helped a lot. And it again, sort of the western part of the country was the biggest part, although there were some parts down south that benefited, but it wasn't quite enough information for some of the locations. So we sort of sat back. We did a lot more testing. I got feedback, and some of it was feedback that was, a little bit on the angry side, like, what are you doing? This isn't giving us the results we need. So in California in particular, we incorporated a climate zone data. And so what we did then was look at both low temperature tolerances for plants, but also high temperature tolerances for plants.
Right, exactly.
And so with those sort of narrowing of that, we could really narrow the bands in the landscape where plants would, be able to tolerate extremes, both, from just actually weather, but also altitude, et cetera. Yeah. And so it actually, it's been an incredibly complex process, and I'm a scientist and I've studied, a lot of behavior, but I'm not a database. I'm not a sort of, programming SQL sort of person.
Right.
So it's been a really huge team effort on Audubon's part, pulling in folks from IT, our digital team, our integrated marketing, all of this that have helped sort of figure out the ways to get around these issues and to really just refine and hone in on the proper solution.
Yeah.
So I think that what I learned from that was that really you need a team, right?
Yep.
A team is really a helpful thing.
Yeah.
People bring such different perspectives. They bring different areas of expertise. They bring different skill sets. And that really has helped me as I've led this project to just pull in these different strands and think, oh, okay, how can we solve this? What do we need? How do we do this? Oh, if we need to do that, how do I get, I'm not a GIS expert. How can I get a GIS layer that can help solve that problem? And so that team really has been the way that we've been able to solve stuff. Yeah.
So as you were sharing early on about the native plant database and how it was working and the effectiveness of it, that was what was going through my mind. It's like, oh my gosh, especially in Arizona and California, that one zip code can be in practically 3 different time zones, right?
Right.
I'm kidding, of course, but they're large, and and then county data, and wow. So that's kind of what was going through my head as you were sharing about that. It's like, oh my gosh, how on earth did you get to success on that?
Yeah.
So it's been quite a journey. Yeah. Perfect. So then my next question for you is, what do you consider your biggest success? And I'll let you go wherever you want on that one. I
mean, I think that again, I would probably, and I sort of live, breathe, and think about this program a lot, and I think that it's really difficult when you're working on a national program like this. That it's an interesting tension, right? It's a national program, but it's hyper local in its approach, right?
Exactly.
It has to meet individual needs, and it has to meet. Our local chapters are they're the face of Audubon in local communities, and so we have to support them. And I think that through these efforts that our team has done, we sort of met that challenge. And I definitely, I give talks about this around the country and talk to people about this, and I always reinforce that it's a dynamic process in the sense that we're constantly working to update it. And so I mentioned local nurseries that will carry native plants.
Right.
You'll be well aware, right, that that's a very dynamic landscape.
Oh, yeah.
Nurseries are coming on the scene. Nurseries are fading away. Nurseries are changing their stock. So how we actually incorporate that, and if I'm speaking to an audience and I say, of a nursery that's not listed in our database, tell me about it, and I can get it right in there.
Yeah.
So it is a very dynamic process, but I feel like increasingly the feedback that I'm getting from around the country about it is really positive.
Yeah.
And so that sort of tension of national program that is hyper-local, I think we're meeting that challenge, like I said, and I think that we really are getting to a place where, we can with confidence go to, a local person, a local Audubon, and say, here, use this tool, and, we're going to try and set you up for success. And I think that increasingly we're doing that.
Beautiful. So what drives you?
Well, conservation. In a word, I live in Los Angeles. As often as I can, I get out into the natural world, which is certainly easy enough and possible to do here. I do. I volunteer for my local Audubon chapter doing monitoring, and I just want to leave the world, and the world is, when I say that, it's sort of like whatever, like my little world. I just want to leave that in a better way than when I got it. I just think that we all need to. It's always in the back of my mind, like, what are the consequences of my actions, both, like how I do my work, but also how I live my life, what's my water usage, how am I being a good, responsible citizen? And so I think that drives me in sort of every aspect of my life. So I would say conservation, and just thinking about how can I continue to improve myself from that standpoint.
Yeah. Nice. So I'm all about education, and I have to know, is there a book that's been influential for you in this process in your life?
Yes. So, I mentioned that, obviously I'm an ornithologist, and I've had a learning curve with regard to plants, and there's this amazing book by that University of Delaware professor that I mentioned, Doug Tallamy, called Bringing Nature Home, which is, and I know that, I read it as soon as I was given responsibility for this program, and it was really, he's a great writer. He laid out all of this sort of information that I've been trying to impart to you in a very clear and concise and compelling way. So I think that helped me not only wrap my mind around all the complexities of these sorts of issues, but also helped me think about how I communicate about it, both in, sort of in this environment, to people that I just randomly encounter at parties, and they say, what are you about? And so all the ways that we can talk about this, small and large. And so that, I think, has been a really influential, for this particular aspect of my work and the stuff that I care about. It's been a really influential book.
Wow, nice. It sounds like a good one, too.
It is, and it's super accessible.
Yeah.
Some of the there's some complex issues with this, but he just breaks it down so it's really simple to understand why this is important.
Perfect. So, what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, I would say just jump in, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's, as I said, we want anyone anywhere to feel like that they can dig in. And the point of our program isn't for everybody to rip out every last, square foot of turf grass and put natives in. Although if people want to do that, I certainly wouldn't persuade them of it.
Right.
But just any little bit helps. Right, you can participate in this no matter where you are, and I think that even if for whatever reason you have no patch, you don't even have a fire escape, if you go to the database and you put in your zip code, it will link you with your local Audubon, and they definitely have opportunities for you to participate. They're doing local restoration work. They're doing things that are helping your environment, and I think that just jump in. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of time or even a lot of effort, but it can actually have big payoffs.
Yeah, we have a really great Audubon Center here in Phoenix, actually.
You do? I've been there.
Yeah.
Yes. They are fantastic.
Yeah, it kind of merges the lower wetlands. Yes, we do have some wetlands in Arizona.
You do.
And so there's actually ponds next to the river. So it's in a riverbed, and it's a really cool place. Do you have anything you can share about it while I'm talking about Arizona?
Yeah, I love Arizona. So the Rio Salado Center that you're referring to, it's a really fantastic place, and I encourage people if they have the ability, if they're local, go to it. They've done a fantastic job actually at restoring the river and that pond system you're talking about with native plants.
Yes.
And it has had really dramatic effects. So I don't off the top of my head, can't tell you the exact numbers of species, but before they started the work and it was sort of this apocalyptic environment, well, it's probably a little bit, that's a little hyperbolic, but it was, there was just tires and stuff there.
Yep, exactly.
There was very few bird species, but now it's just this incredible environment with cottonwoods and other local native species, and there's so many bird species there. I was there in January of this year, and we went birding the couple mornings that I was there, and you're just seeing, you see all sorts of warblers, you see all sorts of waterfowl, right? That is just, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in the middle of Arizona, but they're there, and they're doing a fantastic job at the center.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for that. I at least wanted to do a shout out to them, given I live about 10 miles north of them.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, John. It has been a treat getting to chat with you.
Absolutely. It's been 100% my pleasure. I've really enjoyed it and really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about the program.
Thank you. And so how can our listeners find out more?
Sure. Well, visit audubon.org, our website. There's actually, we've relatively recently, we've redone the website. It's a fantastic storehouse of resources and information about all of Audubon's work and about news relevant to birds and bird conservation. And then if you go to the conservation tab, you can find the link to the Plants for Birds program. And it has, again, there's a lot of information there. There's all sorts of ways that information about how people can get engaged with it, and then again there's the link to the database, and so it's sort of a one-stop shop. It can direct you to all the resources that we have there.
Great. So you can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/plants for birds. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast.
Do you want to save money at the grocery store, eat more organic, whole foods, cultivate food security, and feel more connected to the earth? If so, then growing your own food is a no-brainer. You wouldn't believe how many people come to me claiming that they can't grow their own food. They think they don't have enough space, that they're too busy, or that they simply don't have what it takes. Perhaps you've fallen for one of these gardening myths. If you think you can't grow food, or if you think the only food that you have access to is what you buy in the grocery store,
I have a life-changing webinar that you need to see. It's free and will help you unearth your inner gardener. I've helped thousands of people just like you learn to grow their own food, and I'm speaking from my own experience when I say that with the right knowledge in place, there is no such thing as a black thumb. With this webinar, you can begin making your garden dreams come true and start growing delicious, nutritious food for your family. Just text GARDEN to 44222 or go to iwanttogarden.com and you will receive our free webinar about the 7 key factors you need to know to grow your own food. Remember, that's GARDEN to 44222 or iwanttogarden.com.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.